Greetings, APUSH scholars, for our Unit 14 review on World War II. I'm looking at the review sheet from top to bottom, and the first and third points on the review sheet, we're looking at the neutrality acts of the 1930s. And of course, the intention here is very isolationist. It's to keep us out of war. In 1935, the first neutrality act that's passed bans the sale of weapons to belligerents, to countries who are at war with each other. 1936, no loans to such countries. 1937, no sales to countries at civil war, a nod to what's going on in Spain. No travel on belligerent ships, again a nod to the Lusitania. No arming of merchant ships that are trading with belligerents. Things change a little bit here. There's a shift towards intervention with the 39 revision to the Neutrality Acts allowing cash and carry. You bring your own boat, we'll put weapons on it for you. You got to pay us cash. We're not floating you a loan. Also in 1939, this is not part of the Neutrality Acts, but the Declaration of Panama pushes out the American protection zone out here 300 miles off the coast of North and South America. 1940, you see the Destroyer for Bases deal, and you have one more of these Lend-Lease Acts, and that is allowing, not Lend-Lease, Neutrality Acts, which is a Lend-Lease Act, and that's when the Brits run out of money, we loan them weapons, we loan them war material, and the Lend-Lease is also extended to the Soviet Union, and very little bit goes to China as well. But what you should be seeing here is over time, the pendulum, the needle turns from we want nothing to do with your problems, we're not going to sell, we're not going to loan, we're not going to be on your ships, to okay, you can send your ship and we'll take cash and you can take it away, and then we will give it to you on loan. And this is kind of a fiction here. Also in 1940, you have the crackdown on sales to Japan of iron and steel and aviation fuel, followed by any sort of petroleum and machine tools, and eventually a freeze on Japanese assets. This is all happening before Pearl Harbor. You have in 1940 the selective service. The draft is reinstituted, first time in peacetime. And in 1941, you have the Battle of the Atlantic, which is this naval war between the Brits and German U-boats, and the Americans are aiding in the hunt for subs. And the United States occupies Greenland and Iceland preemptively to keep the Nazis from seizing them. In 1941, you have the Atlantic Conference, or the Atlantic Charter, which is this declaration of war aims. And this is before we are at war. Senator Gerald Nye. In the 30s, you have this meeting of a Senate investigating committee looking at banking and munitions industry profits during World War I. And the conclusion is that obscene profits were made, and without specifically saying so, there's this idea that the U.S. was duped into World War I. This is part of the whole isolationist movement of the 20s and the 30s that leads all the way, as we approach Pearl Harbor here. Effects of World War II on various groups. Japanese-American internment. FDR allowed 110,000 Japanese to be interned, to be put in prison camps for the duration of the war under Executive Order 9066. Why? Because their loyalty was suspect. There was the fear of espionage, the fear of sabotage. This is following that attack on Pearl Harbor that killed and wounded thousands. The 442nd Nisei Regimental Combat Team. This is the most highly decorated regiment of the U.S. military during World War II. These are Japanese Americans who volunteered to fight and who fought in Europe. And the original recruits were 14,000 soldiers, actually 4,000 soldiers who were replaced 2.5 times over because of the extreme casualties, for a total of 14,000 soldiers, overwhelmingly Japanese Americans. They earned 9,500 Purple Hearts out of that 14,000 that joined. Earlier violations of civil liberties during the war. AP has asked you to look at the past when there were violations. Think of John Adams and the Alien and Sedition Acts during the war between France and Britain, which was dragging us in, interfering with our trade. Think of Lincoln and his suspension of habeas corpus. Think of Woodrow Wilson and the Espionage and Sedition Acts during World War I. As far as black Americans go, A. Philip Randolph is the head of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, And he is threatening a march. In fact, he's organizing a march on Washington, D.C. to protest discrimination in war plants. And this leads to another executive order, 8802. This is FDR saying any war plant that receives government contracts cannot discriminate based on race here. So the march is held off. Philip Randolph gets black workers equal pay with whites in war plants, and any plant that wants to get a contract will do what they need to do to get this contract, including paying fairly. Tuskegee Airmen, approximately 1,000 black pilots will fly combat missions during World War II, and there is discrimination during the war. Blacks will serve in the various military services, but ultimately they're always under a white officer. The idea of double V, this is a phrase in the black community during World War II, which refers to the fight against aggression overseas against the Nazis, the Italians, and the Japanese, but it also refers to the fight against racism at home, that this is the beginning of a fight against Jim Crow and segregation. The Indians, the Code Talkers, are the most famous of the Indians. These are about 500 Indians recruited by the Marines to bypass the need for secret codes. You put a Navajo on one end, on the other, and the Japanese did not have any way of translating just a language spoken straightforward, which they did not know. There were other Indian groups, but the Navajos are the most famous and the largest Indian tribe. Mexicans, the braceros, these are farm workers who are invited to work to pick American crops. And the Zoot Suit riots, these are bar fights in Southern California between American servicemen going off to war and Mexican-American youths who are considered to be, sort of dandies and wearing these fancy outfits in a time of clothing rationing. And Americans are going off to fight, and these Mexicans are sort of seen as dodging the war. Many of them are illegals, or at least some of them are illegals. And on top of this, you have racism, and you have alcohol, and you have competition for scarce women, and you have all these things going on, and you have these basically race riots between Anglo and Mexican Americans. As far as women go, women work in the war industry. Millions of women taking the jobs of men, and of course the iconic representative of these women is Rosie the Riveter. About 400,000 women will serve in the military. They serve as nurses. They serve as pilots. They serve in auxiliary roles. They're secretaries. They are running, they're telephone operators. And you've got the WACs, the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, is one example of these women, freeing up men to go overseas and fight. The effect of war on life in the U.S., well, you've got the draft, conscription, you've got the Office of War Mobilization, a little bit similar to the WIB during World War I. You have the first withholding of money from American paychecks, and taxes are going up to pay for this war. Kind of a 50-50 borrowing and more heavy taxation. Inflation goes up. You have virtual full employment. Again, you have women moving into the workforce, and you have movement of people, and that leads us to demographic changes on your review sheet here. You've got blacks moving to the north to make more money in factories in the north, which are booming. You have the movement of military bases to the south to take advantage of better weather for training, and you've got industry moving to the west coast as which is where the war against Japan is being launched from. Payment for World War II, again, war bonds, debt increases significantly, grows way more than it ever did during the Great Depression under the New Deal, and you have increased taxation again. The Pacific, China, 1930s, what you need to know is World War II starts in the Pacific with the Japanese attack on Manchuria in 31, attack on Shanghai in 32, and the Japanese continue into China. And the Japanese resented U.S. foreign policy before Pearl Harbor, before December 7, 1941. And again, the United States has cut off the sale of steel and iron. This is in the last year leading up to the outbreak of conflict between us and the Japanese. Cut off the sale of steel and iron, and first aviation fuel, then all petroleum, freezing bank assets. The Japanese feel that we're sort of economically at war against them, and in a sense, we are. Leapfrogging refers to bypassing Japanese-held islands on our way towards Japan. And one of the more famous is, I'm not sure how this is pronounced, Rabaul. Rabaul is how I would say it. On the island of New Britain off the coast of New Guinea, Japanese dug in. They had 110,000 soldiers on this island. We just went around it. We starved them. We surrounded, We had ships and submarines basically blocking off supplies, and why fight them when you can starve them? They were trapped there until the end of the war. And this is true with many other islands. We just leapfrogged past them, and the Japanese couldn't supply, and they couldn't remove them, and the Japanese couldn't get off these islands to threaten us. So we leapfrogged. It's one of the strategies of the Pacific War. Douglas MacArthur is the commander of the U.S. forces in the Pacific. The battles of the Coral Sea and Midway stopped Japanese movement south towards Australia, and Battle of Midway stops Japanese movement east towards Hawaii, towards the would be the Eastern Pacific. American movement in the Pacific towards Japan. In addition to the leapfrog business here, you've got MacArthur, who's moving from New Guinea to the Philippines, and to his left you have a separate leapfrogging movement by Chester Nimitz through not exactly the Central Pacific, but the Central Pacific Islands. So you have these dual movements moving, sort of merging on what would be Iwo Jima and Okinawa, just right below Japan. The flag raising on Iwo Jima, what you should know about Iwo Jima, this little scrap of island, 4.5 by 2.5 miles wide, see 7,000 American Marines die taking this island. Okinawa, you have 11,000 Americans die, 38,000 wounded. These islands give, and the other leapfrog attacks are showing the willingness of the Japanese to fight to the last man and to take as many Americans down with them while they're fighting suicidally. So these are bloody islands to acquire at great cost of American life. The Manhattan Project is the project to build the atomic bomb. The Enola Gray is the plane that drops the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima, and the second city that is nuked is Nagasaki. The justification is to save American lives. It was expected. The planned invasion of Kyushu is Operation Olympic, which didn't ever take place, fortunately, and Operation Coronet and Honshu. It was estimated that 800,000 Americans would invade Kyushu, and then 1 to 1.7 million would invade Honshu, and the casualties were expected to be catastrophic. So a little editorial here. Do not let anyone tell you that the bombing of these cities was barbaric or any sort of atrocity. The Japanese started this war. The Japanese killed people, especially in China, by the millions. The prisoner of war casualty rate for Americans was 43 or 42%. If you saw the movie Unbroken, you get an idea of what was going on. To give you a contrast here, the Nazis, the bad guys, the Germans, American survival rate was 97% if you were shot down over Germany or if you were a prisoner of war. So the Japanese were, these bombings shortened the war considerably. And to be against Hiroshima and Nagasaki, because they're atomic bombs, forgets the many bombs that were dropped on other cities. Notably, Tokyo lost about 100,000 in incendiary bombing. So, this is war. War needs, the Japanese started it, and these bombings arguably stopped it. End of editorial. Europe, why did the U.S. and Britain focus on defeating Germany before defeating Japan, especially after Japan had attacked Pearl Harbor December 7, 1941? Well, the thinking here is that the Brits and the Soviets are on the ropes, and if we do not help them defeat Germany first, then we'll be fighting everybody alone. So that's the rationale. And supposedly American supplies and men were supposed to go to Germany as a priority, but the reality is the war was fought pretty 50-50. We raised military of about 13 million men, and American factories running around the clock produced this crazy amount of war material, which was good for fighting wars on two fronts. Operation Torch, 1942, the Americans and the Brits land in North Africa. And the idea here is to move through the Sahara, move to Sicily, and sort of hopscotch into Italy, when what Churchill called the soft underbelly of Europe. But Operation Torch is invasion of North Africa in 1942. Vichy held French Morocco for one. The reason for Soviet anger at Britain and the U.S. before D-Day, well, remember, the Germans invade the Soviet Union in the summer of 1941 with 3.2 million men. And the German atrocities in the Soviet Union are sort of unfathomable. There's about 20 million Soviets killed, that's including civilians, about 20 million made homeless, 70,000 villages destroyed, about 1,700 towns, 40,000 miles of railway track, two-thirds of Soviet industry, 1 out of 4 Soviet citizens were either killed or wounded. The ratio of Russian to U.S. dead soldiers was 80-1. 95% of Western casualties in Europe were Soviets, not Americans or Brits. So Stalin is watching this meat grinder just slaughter his people and destroy his territory. The Germans are on a war of sort of almost a religious annihilation of these subhuman Slavs. And it looks to Stalin like we are delaying, and especially when we're landing in North Africa. What are we doing in the Sahara Desert? Well, the Nazis are killing Russians, and Stalin has an idea that really we're hoping for a lot of communists to die before the war is over. So Stalin was very resentful. He felt that we sort of had a plot to engage the Nazis on the Western Front in a timely manner. The D-Day invasion is the name of the beginning of that second front, also called Operation Overlord, also called the Normandy invasion. Normandy is that part of northern France where Americans, Canadians, and British landings take place. And the guy who's in charge of this is Dwight D. Eisenhower. He's the commander, the Supreme Allied commander of the Allied troops in the European theater of war, sort of the counterpart to Douglas MacArthur in the Pacific. Lend-Lease, again, Lend-Lease is this kind of this fiction that we're loaning these weapons and this war material and that we'll get it back at some point. This is the donation, the giving of weapons, first and foremost to the Brits, but around Norway to Murmansk in Russia, and also about $2 billion at the time, maybe the equivalent about $20 billion in today's money, goes to China. The Battle of the Bulge, this is the last-ditch counteroffensive of World War II by the Germans. It's the bloodiest battle that the Americans fight, about 89,000 casualties. It's a bloodier battle than the Normandy invasion, and this is a German loss, ultimately. The Casablanca Conference, 1943, you have the meeting of Churchill and Roosevelt in Casablanca in Morocco and North Africa. And what the key thing you need to know out of this conference is this war will be fought for unconditional surrender. There'll be no terms given to any of the Axis powers. Harry S. Truman, on the bottom of your sheet here, he is the person who will decide to drop the atomic bombs in Nagasaki and Hiroshima, and he is the president who concludes the war. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt dies just before the war ends here. And why does the U.S. refuse to bomb the gas chambers of the death trains to Jewish concentration camps? There's some controversy over this, and in retrospect, maybe we should have, maybe we certainly could have. But according to the World War II Foundation, I was just looking on the internet here, you had 43,000 Allied planes or American planes shot down, 40,000 killed, 18,000 wounded, 12,000 missing. I read somewhere in one of the World War II history book, you had about a 25% chance of getting shot down. Now, you might survive, you might become a prisoner of war, you might die, but it was a very dangerous thing to be flying over Germany in particular. And the thinking was that the first priority of these flights was not to rescue Jews, not to rescue civilians, not to rescue POWs in prison camps or concentration camps, but the first priority is to smash and crush and destroy and kill the German army. And again, this, in retrospect, we can debate the morality of not taking out these camps and sort of slowing down the killing of Jews. But the rationale at the time was to protect Americans on the ground, and these flights were dangerous. So if the danger should be primarily to protect Americans' boots who are fighting the Nazis. And once the Nazis are defeated, the war will be over and everybody will be freed. So that was the thinking. Again, it's one of these things that there's some controversy over, certainly like the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But there you have it. There's your review. And study hard, study early, study a couple times, and good luck. Bye.